Hi there.
Hi, you ready? All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Six Bridges Book Festival. We are so happy to have you here. Thank you for being here. My name is Arshia Khan, and today I have the wonderful honor and privilege of chatting with the brilliant Katherine Angel. And she is the author of Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. And if you haven't already picked up a copy, feel free to do so. I will put a link in the chat box. We have a wonderful local bookseller, Wordsworth Books, and that is a great place to pick up a copy. They not only have this one, but they have her other work as well. You could also pick up Unmastered or Daddy Issues, which is somewhere in my home, but I'm not sure where. All that said, before we get started, just a couple of small housekeeping things. So hopefully you'll be able to see and hear Katherine and I pretty clearly, but obviously we cannot see or hear you. So if you have a question you would like to ask, please put it in the chat box and then I can ask that for you. Other than that, we're happy to have you here, and Six Bridges has a wonderful lineup this year. So if there are other events, worth checking out. You should get on the website and look and maybe plan for the next few days if you haven't already. That is it, and I will put this link for the book in the chat box. To get started, a little bit more about Katherine before she reads. Katherine Angel is a writer and a lecturer in creative writing at Birkbeck, the University of London. And she is the author of Unmastered, a book on desire, Daddy Issues, and Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. Her writing and research focus on sexuality, psychiatry, feminism, and gender in the 20th and 21st centuries. She has a PhD in the history of psychiatry and sexuality from the University of Cambridge. Her book, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, explores the nuances and complexities of consent, female desire, vulnerability in a post-Me Too world, and asks whether explicit consent really does make sex good again. Thank you so much, Katherine, for being here, for taking the time to join us. I'm not sure what time it is where you are.
It's not too late. It's 7 p.m., a respectable time to do an event.
Not too bad, not too bad. Well, feel free to take over if you'd like to read something. We would love to hear it.
Sure. I thought I could just read a little bit from the beginning of the book. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm recovering from the flu, so my voice is a little scratchy, so forgive me for that. So I'll just read a couple of pages from the opening. Sometime in the early 2010s, the porn actor James Dean made a film with a fan whom he called Girl X. He would do this now and then. Fans would write to him wanting to have sex with him, or he would put out a call to do a scene with James Dean, and the results would go up on his website. In an interview in April 2017, only a few months before the media would be overwhelmed with discussions of assault and harassment by Harvey Weinstein and others, and only 2 years after Dean himself was accused of, though not charged with, multiple assaults, he said, "I have a do a scene with James Dean contest where women can submit an application. And then after long talk and months of me saying, everyone's going to find out, it's going to affect your future, and basically trying to talk them out of it, then we shoot a scene." Little of the Girl X video, in fact, involves sex. It's mostly a long, flirtatious, fraught conversation, circling repeatedly back to whether or not they're going to do this, have sex, film it, and put it online. Girl X hesitates. She moves between playfulness and retreat. She's game, then agonized. She lurches ahead, then stalls. She's torn, reflective, and self-questioning. She thinks her dilemmas out loud, and Dean tries to follow along. She presumably wants to do a scene with James Dean, but when he opens the door to her, she appears to lose some nerve. She walks into the apartment dressed in PVC leggings, a buttoned-up silk cream blouse with black detail. Our gaze is behind the camera, with Dean filming her, and she paces around in agitation, laughing a high-pitched, nervous laugh, saying, "Oh my God, oh my God." We catch glimpses of the space. It's generically anonymous, sparkling surfaces, lots of pale wood, and then glimpses of him as he puts the camera down, distressed jeans, big white trainers. He occasionally brings the camera up to her face. She turns away. He teases her, "You're a college girl, you're smart and shit," as they move back and forth in the kitchen with its gleaming central island, in the corridor with its bright white dado rails and deep red walls. He asks what she wants to be called. She doesn't answer. Well, he says, "I'm going to call you Girl X until you decide what your name is." She's skittish, nervous. "I can't even look at you," moving away, moving in. She sits down at a shiny chrome table on a white bench. They discuss a contract. The footage fades out. We're not privy to the details. It fades back in. She takes a selfie. She's about to sign, but then she stops and says, "What am I doing with my life? What the fuck am I doing with my life?" She can back out at any stage, he says. They can rip the contract up. More fading in and out. We see her sign. "We can figure out a stage name later," he says, "unless you just want to be Girl X." "I don't know," she says in a reluctant drawl. "I have no idea. I've never done this." Girl X's nervousness works to flatter Dean. It's a sign of her awe at meeting this huge, improbable star. But it also works to preempt repercussions she may be fearing, to undermine what might be taken by Dean, by others, as exhibitionism, as asking perhaps for trouble. She's readying herself for exposure. Girl X is doing something geared towards the hungry gaze of others, something she imagines will excite and satisfy a spectator, including perhaps the one inside herself, the one who wants to watch herself having sex with Dean. But when she asks, "What am I doing with my life? What the fuck am I doing with my life?" I feel her imagining too the gaze of another kind of spectator, a sterner, censorious one. Both these spectators, the one egging her on and the one admonishing her, are most likely internalized within Girl X, as they are within many women. The spectator we're primed to satisfy, and the spectator whose disapproval and reprisal we're afraid to provoke. Girl X is reckoning with the spectators inside her head and with the power of spectacle itself. She is the impulsive seeker after pleasure, but she's also alienated, self-conscious, and inhibited. She's wildly aware of the power imbalance between her and Dean. The stakes for her are high, and they make the decision to pursue her own desires immensely difficult to see through. These dissociative flickers, these changes of gear and register, come precisely from the power of punitive ideas about women's sexuality and personhood. Girl X is grappling with questions that many women may ask themselves, that I have certainly asked myself the first time they sleep with a man or the moment they reveal their desire. Will I be in danger? In revealing myself, have I foregone privacy and dignity? Will I be pursued, haunted by my own actions? Will I be able to resist the unwanted desires of others? Has saying yes precluded my ability to say no? When Girl X expresses her ambivalence, "I want to have sex with you," she says, "but I don't know if I want to show the world." Dean is receptive. "You don't want to be slut-shamed," he says. She carries on, like, she says, adopting a blokey voice, "I saw you fuck him. Why don't you fuck me?" This is not an entirely paranoid thought on her part. One of the accused in the 2018 so-called rugby rape trial in Northern Ireland, on entering the room after two other men performed sex acts on the plaintiff, after she said no, allegedly replied, "You fuck the others, why can't you fuck me?" A woman's presumed desire, even just once for one man, makes her vulnerable. Her desire disqualifies her from protection and from justice. Once a woman is thought to have said yes to something, she can say no to nothing. In the film, there are many moments of laughter, joy, and pleasure. It's quite charming. There's humor and playfulness and teasing. Girl X and James Dean seem genuinely to like each other. There's chemistry. And she punctures him, no longer awed. She's sarcastic, cutting. But there's awkwardness and mistimed movements, her ambivalence, his uncertainty. Eventually, they overcome the hurdles. They cross the threshold. They have sex. They're sometimes noisy, but there are silent stretches too, and pauses in the action. She sighs, they laugh, they chat. In as far as it's ever possible to know from the outside, and it's not, it looks pretty good, fun, joyous. They sit in silence for a while, smiling, then agree to go for a cigarette on the balcony. You want me to turn the camera off? He asks. Yes, she says. Okay, he says. She starts getting dressed. The camera goes off, he says. The camera goes off, she says. He walks towards the camera, towards us, the viewers. The camera, he says, will go off. We'll probably never know what happened after this, what happened in the breaks between the filmed sections, what was edited out, what we didn't overhear, what we didn't see. We'll probably never know what Girl X made of the allegations against Dean, whether there were things that day that made her uncomfortable, that caused her sorrow or anger. I don't know Girl X's story. But in the film, I see the painful and familiar experience of being pulled in different directions, of having to balance desire with risk, of having to pay attention to so much in the pursuit of pleasure. Women know that their sexual desire can remove protection from them and can be invoked as proof that violence wasn't in fact violence. She wanted it. Girl X shows us then that it's not only desire's expression, but its very existence that is either enabled or inhibited by the conditions in which it is met. How can we know what we want when knowing what we want is both demanded of us and a source of our punishment? No wonder Girl X has mixed feelings, is paralyzed by uncertainty. James Dean understands none of the melancholic weight of sex for Girl X. He doesn't have to. Girl X, however, has grown up with impossible demands. She is living out the double bind in which women exist, that saying no may be difficult, but so too is saying yes. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. That was perfect. Excellent choice. And also, I know you mentioned that you were sick, and so you sounded a little scratchy, but I could listen to your accent all day. I think it's lovely. So what we can do is, I have a couple of questions I would love to ask, and I'll ask a few of those, and then we can go on and see what the audience would love to chat about.
Sure.
So, of course, there's a million directions we can go in. I mean, this book, there's just a lot of directions we could go in. So I wanted to start simply. So consent is obviously a very big topic in this book, and you talk about consent culture. So maybe if you could begin by telling us maybe a definition of what consent culture is within the modern world. And then I think you also mentioned consent sometimes, consent being a bare minimum almost. And I wanted to ask you about what is beyond consent. So maybe starting with the definition and chatting a little bit more about
that. Yeah, so in the book, I use the phrase consent culture to mean a kind of ethos in which we have decided that the problems in the sexual world, and perhaps especially the problems that women face, can be resolved through what is essentially a legal notion of consent. So obviously, you know, sexual assault, rape, various forms of sexual violence abound, as we know, but so too does bad sex. So sex that doesn't necessarily count as assault on any kind of legal definition, but sex that leaves women feeling miserable. And you know, the research on that is pretty compelling and is pretty depressing, which is that, you know, a great number of women have difficulty experiencing pleasure in sex, experience a lot of pain, and also define good sex in a very sort of low horizon way. You know, women tend to define good sex as being sex that isn't painful, whereas men tend to define good sex as sex which leads to orgasm. So, you know, I'm interested in both of those things in the book. And part of what I'm trying to do in the book is point to what I think is this kind of assumption that has become more and more evident, which is that if we get the notion of consent right, and if we get consent laws right, then all the rest will follow. You know, sexual violence will decline, but so too will kind of sexual unhappiness. And I think that's I think that's a red herring. I think that's a misconception. And so, I try to be really clear in the book that the book is not anti-consent. It's not anti-consent laws or guidelines. And in fact, affirmative consent, which is, a complicated phenomenon, is, I think, broadly the right way to approach sex, which is that, it's a model of consent where individuals should be interested in what the other person wants. They should be interested in whether the person they want to have sex with wants to have sex with them. And that broadly, I think, one way to do that, to find out if the person you want to have sex with wants to have sex with you, is to ask them, or to have a kind of culture of conversation around in sex where you kind of express desire to one another. But in a sense, what I try to do in the book is kind of put the legal questions aside, partly because I think that we get distracted by some of those questions, because I think that a good consent law can help us establish the boundary between non-consensual and consensual sex, between rape and not rape, partly. But beyond that, it can't actually do very much. It can't help us answer the bigger questions, which is, why do so many people have sex that leaves them feeling miserable and humiliated and upset and in pain? But also, why are we culturally so resigned to that? What other things are not being included in the conversation when we really fixate on this question of consent? And to my mind, there are so many things that we need to be focusing on in and around sex, which are to do with communication and collaboration and openness and trust and risk. And none of these things can be solved by consent. So, it's a tricky thing I'm trying to do, because on one hand, I'm trying to say, consent has to be the bare minimum for any sexual interaction. But really, what is going to guarantee better sex for people is not a legal notion. And I think it's also kind of worrying, because when we fixate on that kind of, what I call consent culture, I think what we end up doing is placing the burden on women to be the vehicles of improving sex. So, reducing the chances of women themselves being assaulted or bullied or coerced. And that is really problematic. And that's where the book then, turns into a kind of discussion of sexual desire and whether we can kind of know what we want and be clear about what we want. But we can talk about that more if
yes.
I'm interested to hear that.
No, that's beautifully said. And actually that leads into my next question. Exactly. So you mentioned the idea of sexual desire, erotic desire. And I think in the book, you mentioned that it doesn't just exist within us. It's not a fully formed desire, that this is something that happens through exploration, hopefully with someone else, collaboration. And my question is, I wrote here that the self-discovery is compromised in women. And you talk about that a lot. Can you tell us more about your thoughts on the difference between this realization of sexual or erotic desire, the difference between a woman's experience and a man's?
Sure. Yeah, I think you put it really nicely. It's compromised in women because, we live in a society where, we know how risky it is to express our sexual desire, because every time we hear about an assault case or a harassment case, women's own desire or behavior that is seen as expressing their desire is kind of brought back against the woman, and as a way to exonerate a man from an accusation. So, we grow up knowing that our desire can be used against us, or our presumed desire, whichever one it is. So quite naturally, I think expressing sexual desire, even if we feel it, can be difficult because we know how it can be used against us. And relatedly, because of that, it can also be hard to experience our sexual desire. If you live in a culture which is pretty intent on punishing women for their sexual desire, of course, that's going to affect how women feel about their sexuality. And whether they can in fact be in touch with their own sexual desire, because sexuality and pleasure and enjoyment are things that involve risk. But if you live in a world where that feels very risky, then of course that will be compromised. So part of my kind of my quarrel in a way with some of the rhetoric around consent is that it sort of performs a willful covering up of its own ears about that, like when children like la la la, I'm not going to listen to that. We know these things about the culture that we live in, but for the purposes of the consent conversation, sometimes we pretend that those things are not the case, and that I find really disturbing, this kind of bifurcation of awareness about these things. So I'm very interested in how women are often addressed in this way. The best thing you can do for your own sexual enjoyment and your pleasure, but also your safety, is to know your desire and express it, to go inwards and find your sexual desire. I mean, yeah, great. That would be great. For a lot of women, that's not an option for cultural reasons. It's not an option because they are the victims of sexual assault, and it's not easy for them to even explore or touch their own sexuality. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in the book is to think about that language of sort of exploration of desire, and whether you can know your desire, how that differs in relation to men and women. And there's been this very interesting research that's unfolded in the last sort of 10, 20 years that has really put forward the case that women's sexuality is different. Women's desire doesn't go in a kind of linear way from the spontaneous experience of desire, I just want to have sex, I just feel like I want to have sex, to then feeling excited and then reaching orgasm. These researchers have suggested that it's a much more circular process, and that in fact for women sometimes desire can be slower to emerge, but it can be a desire that emerges in response to arousal. So it's very interesting research because it focuses on the kind of conditions for desire emerging. Mm-hmm. And it suggests that in the right conditions, you might not think, I really feel like having sex, but you might start from a neutral position, as some of these researchers put it, and then kind of get warmed up basically through the experience of physical kind of sensations and arousal building, that might then kind of convert into sexual desire, where you think, actually, I really do want to have sex. Mm-hmm. And I think that research is so fascinating because it does chime with a lot of women's experiences, I think. And it does point to how context is really important. So, if your context is a context of, being overburdened by domestic duties, living with a violent partner, or feeling under threat in various ways, your capacity for sexual desire is going to be affected. And, that seems very kind of common sense. But the note of caution I sound in the book is that some of this research is being used to, again, kind of really reinforce the idea that men are the sexual creatures. Men have this really libidinal animal desire for sex, that it doesn't kind of respond as intensely to changes in context. Whereas women, it's much more contextual, but it's also more sort of cognitive. It's more about whether you think, I'm open to sex because I want to keep my partner happy, or I want to create intimacy, or feel close. And I think that, if that's empirically true, that men and women experience sex and desire differently, then that's very, very interesting. But one of my arguments isn't the context maybe also what is shaping those divergent experiences of sex? Mm-hmm. Because, and not to kind of be too broad brush about it, because obviously this is all kind of affected by other factors such as, socioeconomic status, or race, or, immigration status. I mean, there are so many factors that go into everyone's unique experience. But broadly speaking, heterosexual men, their desire is contextually elicited everywhere they turn. Their desire is encouraged and affirmed and approved. And that is not the case for women. So these differences may exist, but might they not point to the fact that we live in quite different worlds depending on our gender?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes to all those things. I feel like these are such it's so funny the way you said that. A lot of it is obvious, but I feel like it's so ingrained in us, the way we're raised, especially in the West. I feel as though we don't even notice.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, and just for me personally, it wasn't until I read this that I felt like it broadened my mind in a way that I hadn't before. And I consider myself very, open and knowledgeable, and I read a lot. And it really, this book blew me away. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm pleased. Yeah, I think it is so ingrained, and it's it's ingrained in so many different kinds of ways. Some of it is at the kind of cultural level in terms of what we see on our screens and the messages that are imparted to us in all the media we consume, and some of it is ingrained in the law and in very kind of state systems, very large structural systems that are really hard for us to intervene in individually or culturally. And it is, it's very difficult. And sometimes, when I think about it, or when I was writing the book, sometimes I felt like, God, it's quite bleak in a way. The odds are not good on women, and not just women experiencing kind of pleasure and joy in their kind of physical embodied lives. And that's such a loss for everyone, and it's entangled, I think, also with so many other things like anxiety and violence. And because I think that a lot of the time, kind of these very constrained norms of masculinity are so relevant to the whole discussion as well. And they're also what if the norms of masculinity are so kind of restrictive and punitive, which I really think they are. I mean, men are punished all the time for not fulfilling a certain ideal of masculine behavior, and a lot of male violence towards women, but towards men as well, is about that failure, or that perceived failure, whether in themselves or others. It's a kind of chain reaction of violence that just wreaks havoc everywhere. And so it can be quite disturbing to to think about that, but I guess we have to.
Yeah, we have to. And I think it's beautiful the way that this this conversation is becoming more and more of a reality, broadly speaking. And it's nice that books like this exist and we're having this conversation, however bleak it may seem sometimes, because it, at least for me, it gives me hope that things will change, or people will at least come to an awareness that they didn't have before.
Yeah. And I think it is quite an interesting moment, because I feel that various people have gone away sort of after Me Too and sort of rethought quite a lot of these conversations. And there are some really, really fascinating books around at the moment that I think are pinpointing something in a new way, or looking at the landscape, which is a really bleak landscape, but one in which I do think that there are more conversations happening, and a new kind of joining the dots together. And books like Amir Srinivasan's book, The Right to Sex, has been really, really interesting in that respect. And there's a book about violence kind of within sex called Rough by Rachel Thompson, I think is her surname, that's partly about the kind of the legal defense that has kind of apparently risen recently in terms of kind of kinky sex being invoked as a legal defense for men who've been accused of strangling and sometimes murdering sexual partners. And there's a book by Alexandra Brodsky called Sexual Justice that I just started reading, that's particularly, I think, about the American context of legal questions to do with sexual assault, and kind of how does the justice system address something so systemic as sexual violence. And I feel like it's an exciting moment, you know, which is good. It's a silver lining.
Yes, agree. And I'm glad you mentioned The Right to Sex. That's currently sitting in my cart. I haven't bought it, but I've heard wonderful things.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? The chat seems oddly quiet. We will not bite. Feel free to ask. We have a question. This is from Dorian Stuber. And they ask, your description of the video is fascinating, the James Dean video. I wonder what's at stake in the beginning of the book by discussing a representation which seems, I'm sorry, and we're getting more questions. Your description of the video is fascinating. I wonder what's at stake in the beginning of the book by discussing a representation which seems to combine two genres, porn film and reality TV and video. Do representations encapsulate the realities of ordinary life that you are talking about, or do they shape those realities or differ from them?
Thanks, Dorian. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, one of the answers to that question is that I really love writing about moving images. I really like to write about film and TV, and I often find it's a really useful way in for me to write. And when I saw that Girl X video, I mean, I was completely transfixed by it, and I watched it many times, and I transcribed it. I transcribed every little bit of speech and every action. So I have a document that's like extremely long. And you know, eventually this kind of short section was the opening of this book. But you know, there were so many things I could have written about in relation to that video. And I did have some other writing that was a bit more about James Dean himself and this kind of really interesting, complex trajectory in his life, which, you know, that he was held up as this kind of like feminist male porn star who he was, I would say, kind of quite idealized in certain circles. And then there were these assault allegations against him, which, you know, he's not been charged with sexual assault, but, you know, then, you know, there was a shadow kind of cast over his rather, or like almost kind of wholesome, cheery boy next door kind of vibe, which, I mean, you know, also coexisted with like, you know, pretty intense hardcore pornography. So I was quite kind of fascinated by him. And then some of the stuff that he would say in interviews and the way he responded to those allegations was also in terms of his concern about women watching porn and the effects of porn. So he just, you know, he's occupied this very interesting, strange space where he, I think, kind of in many ways has had his cake and eaten it too. You know, he's been this kind of porn star, and then he gets to kind of slightly hand-wringingly worry about, you know, the effect of pornography on these nice young women. So, you know, I could have written a whole chapter about him, but you know, that, I mean, obviously the question of pornography is so huge, and I mean, in all honesty, I really don't know what to say about the question of pornography. It's, you know, it's very pervasive. It's a source of great pleasure for people. It's you know, I believe in the right to sexual expression and perversity, and, you know, I think pornography can be a good thing, but obviously, you know, the relationship between it and how we understand our own sexuality is profound, and I think it's naive to pretend that that's not the case. But with that video, you know, in particular, I think what I found so fascinating was precisely this question that, you know, you raise in your question, which is like, does it encapsulate the realities of ordinary life? I mean, that film in particular, for me, really did. I mean, most of it wasn't sex. Most of it was a conversation between a man and a woman, where a woman is desperately trying to convey the complexity of sex for her, the complexity of her desire to indulge in her fantasy. You know, she had this fantasy to have sex with this like massive porn star. And, you know, good for her. If that's what she wants, then good for her. but it was terrifying for her, and it was clearly really complex and provoked all kinds of really difficult feelings. And I felt for her. I felt so profoundly for her, because I felt like I know what that's like, not because I want to have sex with James Dean and post it online, but because I want pleasure and joy in my life. And I know, in my decades of being an adult, like, I know that can be very difficult to manage and negotiate, because there is always somebody who would like to punish you for your sexual pleasure, or to punish you for expressing your sexual desire. And so the stakes, that I felt that she felt so deeply, and that it was like a battle within her, like a visible battle within her in that film. I just felt like Girl X is me. Like, I know that, and I suspect I'm not alone in that feeling of doubt and anxiety. And am I doing something stupid? Am I going to regret it? Is everybody going to target me for this choice? Obviously it was on a kind of quite spectacular scale for her, but that was very, very familiar. And to that extent, it felt like very ordinary life for me.
And I can, maybe I'm going out on a limb and saying this, but Girl X felt like a lot of women. It feels like it could have been a friend or yourself. It's just the reading of that feeling was familiar. And it's interesting. I didn't talk to any men after I read the book, but I'd be curious to hear what they thought that was, or what that, because I don't think a lot of men have that same experience in any capacity. But reading through that, it was an incredibly familiar feeling. So perhaps ordinary is a good word for it.
Yeah. And also, I suppose one of the things I found really fascinating about it was the way it, there was a sense of ships in the night in their dialogue. I mean, he gets it conceptually. He's like, oh yeah, I get it. You don't want to be slut shamed. But, at one point he says to her, like, but you just tell those guys to fuck off. Like, you're a badass. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's the bind, isn't it? And that's the dilemma, in a way, that's at the heart of my book, which is that, on the one hand, women don't want to be cowed by the sexual violence that surrounds them. We don't want to not go out and pursue our desires. We don't want to be too frightened to go anywhere at night, etc. But the fact is, we know that violence is often just around the corner, and we know that if it happens to us, we will be subjected to every humiliation and every bullying, insinuation by police or lawyers or whatever, that exist in the panoply of all the things that we see. So that experience is, I think, goes really deep in women, like whether women identify as feminists or not, whether they're interested in these things or not. Like most women you talk to, they know that, and it affects their behavior. And I think, part of what's fascinating about that video is that James Dean, like, he kind of gets it, but at some level he's just like, well, you can choose between being like the weak woman or the like sexy confident woman. And I think that dilemma, that those two choices for women are also what is so widespread in the culture, and also in some of the debates about consent. Some of the critics of consent that I don't share their kind of conclusions, but I admire some of them as kind of thinkers in a lot of ways. Some of their rhetoric is, well, in my day, we weren't so kind of scared and vulnerable, and we just kind of, if a guy was being a bully, we would just kick him out of bed. And, and there's a sense that, as a woman, you have to choose between identifying with the victim or identifying with the powerful. And I want to refuse that choice. I think I shouldn't have to behave in a certain way in order to be safe from sexual violence, and in order to be able to pursue my sexual pleasure. And I don't think that people are either vulnerable or strong. Like, people have the desires that they desire, and ideally they would be able to pursue them, but they live in a world full of sexual violence and shaming. So what do we do?
Absolutely. And we have another question, but I feel I need to mention this on the cusp of this talk. This entire weekend I spent it in Nashville at a bachelorette party, and lots of fun ensued. And at one point, one of my friends who was so beautifully dressed up, and we were out in the city, and she kept getting catcalled, and men kept saying things to her. And at one point, she turned to me and she said, "I wish I could just dress nicely for myself and didn't have this constant barrage of men." And I understand that that's not perhaps a direct threat of violence, but that's sometimes what it feels like. And she dealt with that all yesterday evening, and she was really upset about that. And I thought it was really funny because it was on the cusp of our talk, and this idea of sexual violence being so it's so readily accessible in a woman's life all the time. I feel like this is something we're confronted with all the time, and sometimes I feel like I don't know. I wish it was something we talked about more. I really do.
Yeah, and just hearing you speak about your friend, then it made me think about I don't know if you've heard of this case here recently of a young woman who was killed, Sarah Everard, in London. So she was walking home one evening and was abducted and assaulted and killed. And it was, there's been a lot of stuff about it, partly because so some of the discussions about it were kind of saying, she did everything right in terms of she walked home like the kind of safe route home. She texted her boyfriend to say, I'm on my way home. People knew where she was. Like, she'd done everything right, and yet she still got raped and murdered. And I found that so chilling when I would hear that phrase, because I think women should be able to do everything wrong.
Yeah.
I think we should be able to do what we like and not be raped and murdered, and also not be made responsible for our rape and murder. And in that case, it's really snowballed, because there were protests. There was like a peaceful vigil, honoring her, and the police cracked down on it because of COVID regulations. But the police hadn't been cracking down on like anti-mask protests in central London, but they were like, wrestling young women to the ground at the protest. And it's turned out that the person who killed her was a serving police officer who was also known for various flashing incidents and this kind of thing. So, it sparked this whole conversation that, in a sense, I think has been a bit slower in the UK than in the US about police violence and sexual violence, and the link between domestic violence and sexual violence and murder, and the very high rates of domestic violence within police forces. So it's been like incredibly interesting and painful and really terrible. But, this idea that we're even still talking about whether you do something right or wrong, and whether that's relevant to the fact that somebody abducted a woman by arresting her, in fact, on COVID grounds, and abducted her. And, it's just so heartbreaking and horrifying.
And terrifying, yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Was he let go? I would hope he was.
No, actually, no. I think he's been charged. But actually, I can't quite remember what the latest is. But now the police force, the Met police force in London, has been issuing statements saying that if you're arrested by a lone officer, you should then call the police to make sure that this person is a legitimate police officer, which I mean is so just absurd.
Because it's up to us, because it's up to us.
And also he was a serving police officer, so
good God.
Anyway.
Let's move on to the next question, because I will get upset. This is from Erin Finzer, and they say, one of the most exciting takeaways I had from the reading of your book was the validation that women and men don't necessarily know what they desire, but that there is joy in the exploration and discovery. Can you speak, or can you talk more about this concept and how desire, defined or emergent, bears on subjectivity, especially gendered subjectivity. And I think we touched upon that a little bit earlier, but.
Sure. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, I think I wrote the book partly because I was really preoccupied by this this mantra almost that I kept hearing everywhere, perhaps especially, post Me Too and in the kind of reiterations of consent in the wake of that, which, it was all to the good. But this kind of mantra that we need to kind of be very clear about what we want, and that it's our duty to know what we want and say what we want, and this will keep us safe. Not everyone is saying that. A lot of consent education is very sophisticated and subtle on precisely these things that that we don't always know what we want and that our desires can change. But a lot of the rhetoric that I was seeing was kind of re-inscribing, I think, this idea that actually has been very enchanting to us, which is that there's something inherently emancipatory for women in particular about knowing their desire and then expressing it very confidently. And I just think that it's not a complete lie, but it's a partial lie, in the sense that not everybody knows what, some people have a very kind of robust and sort of sexual desire that is quite on the surface in them. It comes to the surface very quickly, or some people have that for some periods in their life and not others. Sexual desire changes over different phases of your life in different ways. But for a lot of people, sexual desire is something that has to emerge from quite specific conditions, or is just slower to find its footing. And, as we discussed before, I think actually all sexual desire is emergent. It's just that we don't notice the conditions which make that emergence possible or not, or we naturalize them. We think it's kind of just inevitably part of being a woman that your sexual desire is different from men's or whatever. But all sexual desire is in context. It emerges from a context. It emerges in relation to other people. It also emerges in relation to other people's desires, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You might want to please a sexual partner. You might want to give them what they want. You might want to excite them. That's a kind of relational aspect of sexuality that is part of sexuality. So I think that sometimes, out of a desire to keep women safe, we've insisted too much on the idea that we can kind of go into ourselves and learn about ourselves. So you often find it in kind of sex advice manuals, that you can't know your sexuality in relation to other people until you've discovered it yourself, and you do that by masturbation and fantasy. But to me, masturbation is great, but it's very different, because you're not with another person. And sex for me is fundamentally about the encounter with another person. So learning what I want in myself is just not the same as learning what I might enjoy in sex with a particular other person that might be completely different from what I might enjoy with a different person. So, there's something about the way in which we keep at bay that kind of like non-repeatability of sex, that it is a kind of organic, very strange phenomenon that emerges in a specific moment, in a specific condition, and that can't kind of actually be very easily generalized about. So that, in a way, that's an obstacle, right? It's an obstacle to an approach to sex, which is like, I can sort of just look inside myself and find out what I want, and then I tell somebody, and then we kind of make an agreement, and then hopefully, it all kind of works like clockwork. It's an obstacle to that model, but that's also what the promise is. That's where I want to kind of keep a kind of utopian, like, joyful note in part of the book, which is that that unknowability is exactly why we love sex. That's exactly why sex can be really wonderful, because it can take us by surprise. Sometimes we didn't realize that we would enjoy something or find pleasure in something until we experience it, and that there's something really kind of beautiful and rich about that. Of course, that is utopian, because the fact is that the conditions of sex really matter to whether you're able to take that risk. And for a lot of people, that risk is just not possible. It's not possible because they're exhausted, because they're scared, because they're, dealing with the legacy of sexual trauma, or because their partners are, bullying them, or, all kinds of things, although they just don't live a kind of life where they have the space to explore sexual excitement because they're worried about, keep feeding their children or not being deported, or, the conditions really, really matter. And for a lot of people, those conditions are vanishingly difficult to create and sustain, which in one sense is like, it's quite bleak when you think about it, that the odds are stacked against so many people to be able to have that kind of more collaborative, exploratory, kind of curious relationship to their own pleasures and the pleasures of the other person. But I think that that's really what we have to aim for, partly because sex that we think about in terms of these kind of notions of curiosity and play and mutual exploration, if we can get sex like that, or create conditions for that kind of sex, that sex is much less likely to be non-consensual or coercive or assaultative. So it kind of, it retroactively solves potentially the problem of assault. But also because that sex in itself is like, it's one of the richest human experiences we can have, because it's about, the encounter with the strangeness, not just of our own sexuality and desires, but of the other. Like, that's why sex can be so exciting, is that you're doing this really weird thing with somebody else, and you can sort of transcend into something really magical. But that's risky, and that requires conditions of safety, or some kind of fundamental wellness to be in place in order for that exciting possibility to happen. And that's really where we should aim, because if we aim there, so many other problems won't happen. The pain won't happen, the humiliation won't happen. That's the horizon.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, I hope that we are all heading in that direction, because that horizon looks lovely. It would be nice, and I love that they're, yeah. Well, it looks like we have no more questions in the chat, but I have one question for you. I read Unmastered well after I had read Tomorrow, Sex Will Be Good Again. And towards the end of the book, you quote Susan Sontag, who is one of my favorite writers of all time. And I wrote down the quote, and you wrote, it's quoting her, and she says, "To write, you have to allow yourself to be the person you don't want to be. Of all the people that you are, you have to be lucid, you have to be alone." And it got me thinking about you and your personal writing process. And I was very curious if you would share if there are any like particulars of your writing process, if there's a space or a time, or whatever you would like to share.
Yeah, I always find it slightly kind of funny, or almost a bit embarrassing when people ask me this, because I feel like, oh God, I really don't have a writing process, and I teach in an English and creative writing department, and I'm always trying to help my students find the way to write what they want to write, but for me it's quite chaotic. It's not methodical at all. I'm trying to be more like that, but I just think maybe I'm not a methodical person. I have to just kind of follow my nose and just pursue whatever it is that is interesting me at a particular moment, and try to write into it. This links back to what Dorian had asked about, the film, like sniffing out the things that capture you and that you don't understand why. That for me is always interesting, as if I don't understand why something is preoccupying me or upsetting me or fascinating me or delighting me, and trying to write into that space. And that's often where I figure things out. And I really think that writing for me, I can only really speak for myself, but for me, writing isn't about Sorry, I think my
Oh,
other,
okay, I thought it was me.
no, it reconnected to my other headphones. So okay, you can hear me, can't you?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, for me, writing isn't like, it's not that I have gone away and figured something out and then I write down what I figured out. It's not like something I've learned. I often think about this line from Michel de Montaigne, the French essayist from 16th century, maybe, so a long time ago. But he said about his writing that it's his learning, not his teaching. And that's how I feel about writing. Is like I write things because I'm puzzled and confused and preoccupied. And writing is how I try to understand what to make of something. So for me, the books I've written, they feel like I'm trying to understand something, and I hopefully take the reader with me, and hopefully that's an interesting experience. But I don't start from the position of like there's something I know that I want to impart. It's always from a position of not knowing and not understanding, and that can be very pleasurable and also quite disorienting, because you half the time you spent writing thinking I don't understand anything and I'm an idiot and I don't know what I'm doing, and is it even going to be a book? So it's like it's a fraught process, let's say.
But for what it's worth, as a reader, it's incredibly pleasurable because it feels like you're going on a journey. And it's very interesting to hear your perspective, because that's not what I imagined. I imagined that you had an idea and perhaps you went away to some cabin or cottage somewhere and just wrote for 2 months. But it's interesting that that's the reality of it. And the more I think about it, the more that is what it feels like. But it's pleasurable for the reader. It really is.
I'm glad. There are moments of pleasure for me too, but in amongst the agony.
I can't even imagine. As a non-writer, I love to read. I'm not a very good writer, don't express myself very well in words. I'm a visual artist in every capacity. So when I see things like this, or the way writers do what they do, it's like magic to me.
Yeah, but it is kind of a trick in a way, like Jonathan Glazer. In a way, I like Jonathan Glazer, who's a film director who made Under the Skin, which is one of my favorite films. He said, he talked about his process with making that film and how they went through about like 30 different screenplays, and it was just like, it was this total nightmare. But at the end, he said the trick is at the end to make it look simple, but the process is so far from that. And when I read that, I felt like, I'm not alone, because it was not simple. But if it has some kind of shape at the end, that's what you want. You're trying to sculpt something, and as long as the finished object is pleasing and enjoyable and interesting, then that's just the best feeling. But it's a long road to get there.
Well, I think you were very successful, in my own opinion.
Thank you.
And I think we are coming up on our time. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of Six Bridges, on behalf of me. I am now your #1 fan. Thank you so much for being here. Where can we find you? Would you like to share your Twitter and Instagram and all of that?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, although I don't use it all that much these days. But my Twitter handle is K Engels. It's Kay and then ENGELS.
Okay.
So yeah, that's probably the easiest way to find me.
Okay. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. And thank you for everyone who attended. We appreciate you being here. And don't forget to check out Wordsworth and maybe pick up a copy or 2 or 3. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.